I have to begin by thanking Rose, of course, because she's the principal author of When the Sky Fell, and it was her urging that got us to take the things that we were doing in our study and put them into book form. So if Rose hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here today. So it's to Rose, I thank. We all know that the greatest mass of an iceberg is hidden unseen beneath the surface of the water. And likewise, underlying the search for Atlantis lie many deep prejudices. I believe that Plato's account of Atlantis is a holographic fragment, a sliver of a once common view of the world. In order to reconstruct that worldview, we must revise our assumptions about geography. Words like Atlantic, Libya, and Asia had different meanings to the ancient Greeks than they do to us today. When we realize this, Plato's account can be read without distortion, and we can follow his clues to their logical conclusion. But in order to reconstruct this Atlantean worldview, we have to reconsider our own presuppositions about geography. Here's a map of the Earth centered on North America. And although you may not have seen this projection before, the world is still recognizable. It doesn't challenge any of our current assumptions. North is up, as it has always traditionally depicted. And I should say this is only a tradition because there's no such thing as up in outer space. Notice how this north is up perspective causes the oceans to appear as distinct bodies of water. The Pacific and Atlantic seem to be entirely different oceans. This north is up viewpoint also highlights the separateness of the continents. Now I'd like to show you a map of the world showing south in the up position. Plato's account of Atlantis places the lost continent in what he calls the real ocean. And we can see what he means in this U.S. Naval Antarctic Support Force projection of the world as seen from Antarctica. Notice that all the oceans that we know today, the Atlantic, the Indian, the Pacific, are really one ocean. Oceanographers recognize that the planet has one ocean. This is a geographic fact, and it's a fact that's recorded in Plato's account of Atlantis. And Plato expands on this description to say that the Mediterranean Sea is merely a basin of the ocean separated from it by a narrow channel. Here's the Mediterranean Sea compared to what oceanographers call the world ocean. Seen from this perspective, it is certainly accurate to say that the Mediterranean is really part of the real ocean, separated from it by a narrow entrance at a place what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. Seen from Antarctica, the rest of the continents of the world form a ring around the real ocean. Here's Africa, South America. This is the eastern half of North America. And then there's Asia. And then we have the western half of North America. So this perspective is a little bit different, but it is a perfectly legitimate and accurate description of the Earth's geography. Plato talks about the whole opposite continent, a phrase that makes sense when we see this from Antarctica. It is this whole thing that goes around the ocean. And the whole opposite continent is the thing in Plato's account that has never been understood before. Most researchers treat it as gibberish, or they imagine that it refers to America. But America is only a fragment of the whole opposite continent. Plato acquired the record of Atlantis from his ancestor Solon. As I said, the ancient Greeks used different terms for their geographics than we do today. In Solon time, the Earth island was divided politically into Europe, Libya, and Asia. Libya included all of North Africa. Asia was an area which we call the Middle East. I will be returning to the size of Libya and Asia in a moment, but I want you to notice that the surrounding this Earth island was a vast body of water which the Greeks called the Atlantic Ocean. And it went all the way around. Sure, it's to the west here, and that's what the Atlantic came to mean. But it also was to the south and the east and to the north. So in its true historic sense, Atlantic was a much larger body of water than what we call it today. At the westerly extreme of the Mediterranean is what the Pillar of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a narrow entrance which separates the Mediterranean Sea or basin from the outer ocean. The Pillars of Hercules was the limit of the known world. What lay beyond it was unknown. Plato describes Atlantis as a mountainous, high-altitude island larger than Libya and Asia combined. That would make it slightly larger than the lower 48 states. Antarctica, like Libya and Asia, is slightly larger than the U.S. I've separated Lesser Antarctica, the green area, from Greater Antarctica, the yellow area, because I want to treat these areas separately in a moment. The mere fact that Plato tells us that the Earth contains a vast island continent the size of Antarctica is amazing in itself. He goes on to give a most interesting clue. He says that the whole island continent was high above sea level. And this is also true of Antarctica. Antarctica, as you can see, is by far the highest altitude continent on our planet. The Egyptian priest spoke to Solon about Atlantis in terms he could understand. He passed on an account of the Atlantean worldview from the perspective of somebody standing on the shores of Atlantis. In this map, we see the world as it would have looked like from Atlantis. The ocean is lower at this time, as it was nearly 12,000 years ago. Here's England as part of the mainland. Japan is part of, it has an inland sea, but is connected to Asia. New Guinea and Australia, even and Tasmania, even was part of one landmass. So Antarctica is depicted in its former ice-free state here, and notice the accompanying islands here. Now I'm going to go to the words that Plato uses to describe the location of Atlantis. And these are the words that every search upon Atlantis is based. This island was larger than Libya and Asia together, and from it seafarers in those days could make their ways to the others, islands, and thence to the whole opposite continent, which encircles the true outer ocean. The waters within the channel just mentioned are manifestly a basin with a narrow entrance. What lies beyond is the real ocean, and it is land enclosing the ocean which should rightly be called a continent. So I believe that Plato's account is not a figment of his imagination. It's a fragment from a lost world. But it's not the only clue that we have for locating Antarctica to Atlantis. In 1665, the German Jesuit priest Athanasius Kircher published Mundus Subterraneus, a massive book which included a reproduction of an ancient Egyptian map of Atlantis. The map had been stolen from Egypt by the Romans, probably after the fall of Cleopatra. Now, when this map came into Kircher's possession, he didn't have an accurate globe with which he might compare it. So let's look first at how he saw it. This label up here translates site of Atlantis now beneath the sea according to the beliefs of the Egyptians and the description of Plato. The Egyptians believed that south, not north, was at the top of the world. That made sense to them because that was the direction from which the Nile flowed, and since the Nile was so important to them, it must have been at the top of the world. Kircher's map accepts the Egyptian account that south is up, as can be seen in his compass, which is pointing down. Let's see. So I've turned this upside down now so that we can see it from the north is up perspective. Kircher believed that this map represented Atlantis as an island in the North Atlantic Ocean between Spain and Africa and America over here. But what if Kircher got it wrong? What if the limited geographic knowledge that he had at his disposal caused him to place Atlantis in the wrong place? Let's imagine that we have just excavated this ancient Egyptian map from beneath the paws of the Sphinx. And it is our task to discover how it fits into the planet's geography. If we remove Kircher's labels and symbols, we can see more clearly what he must have had at hand in 1665. Here's what Kircher must have been working with. Now, if we search the globe for a place that might fit this configuration, we find a near-perfect match in a place where south is naturally up. Here's Kirker's Egyptian map of Atlantis compared to a modern geophysical globe showing south in the up position. The present shape of the ice-free Antarctica as depicted in this modern view is based upon the current ocean level, not that of 9,600 BC. Atlantis did not actually sink beneath the waves. Instead, as the old ice caps melted, the ocean level rose, covering some of the continent's permutations. Further distortions in the modern map, compared to Kirker's, are the result of the weight of today's Antarctic ice sheet. This immense blanket of snow and ice depressed parts of the continents, causing more and more land to fall beneath the ocean level. I believe that the Egyptian map of Atlantis represents in size, shape, scale, and position an ice-free Antarctica. But what had happened? How did Atlantis become Antarctica? When Solon was in Egypt, he spoke with one of the most learned Egyptian priests who told him the story of Atlantis. And he tried to get out of the priest's knowledge of the Egyptian past. And he started bragging about the knowledge that the Greeks had. At which point the priest turned to him and said, "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children. There is no such thing as an old Greek. You possess not a single belief that is ancient and derived from old tradition, nor yet one science that is hoary with age." And then he goes on to explain that the story of the flood as told by the Greeks is really only partially complete. And that it is related to the Greek mythology of the story of Phaethon. Now, I don't know if you recall, in Greek mythology, the sun god Helios drove a chariot of flying horses and dragged the sun behind him across the sky each day. And in the story of Phaethon, he allows his son to drive the chariots of the sun. And in the process, because the sun is not strong enough, the sun veers from its ordinary path and sets the world upon fire. And in order to put the fire out, Zeus has to intervene, and he causes a flood. So we have a change in the sun and a flood. Here's what the Egyptian priest said, and I find this interesting because we ordinarily think of Thales as the first scientist. But here's an Egyptian priest who was speaking before Thales, or approximately the same time as Thales was alive. "Many and manifold are the destructions of mankind that have been and shall be. The greatest are by fire and water. But besides these are lesser ones in countless other fashions. Your own story of Phaethon, the child of the sun, yoked his father's path, burnt up things on the earth, and himself was smitten by a thunderbolt and slain, is a mythical version of the truth that there is at long intervals a deviation of the bodies that move around the earth and the heaven, and consequent widespread destruction by fire of things on the earth." So we have this change, we have this long cyclical pattern of a great destruction by fire and water. The sun seems to veer from its path, and there's a great deluge. I wanted to bring this down to Colorado, because that's where we are. And Colorado was once occupied by people known as the Utes. They got to have Utah after them. But Colorado was the preferred location. They were pushed west. And I wanted to read to you a story that they tell, which I believe to be an exact parallel to the Phaethon story. And I did a little bit of analysis of this. Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist, has this thing called structural analysis. This is the sequence of the story and what I'm going to read to you. Sleep, flight, all the way through here, and then down through here. And I've imposed these ideas over top of it. And all these connections that you see here, I think you'll be able to see in this myth. Once upon a time, Taiwats, the hare god, was sitting with his family by the campfire in the solemn woods, anxiously waiting for the return of Taivai, the wayward sun god. Wearied with long watching, the hare god fell asleep, And the sun god came so near that he scorched the naked shoulder of Taiwats. Foreseeing the vengeance which would thus be provoked, he fled back to his cave beneath the earth. Taiwats woke in great anger and speedily determined to go and fight the sun god. After a long journey of many adventures, the hare god came to the brink of the earth, and there watched long and patiently, till at last the sun god, coming out, he shot an arrow at his face. But the fierce heat consumed the arrow ere it had finished its intended course. Then another was sped, but that was also consumed, and another, and still another, till only one remained in his quiver, and this was a magical arrow that had never failed its mark. Taiwats, holding it in his hand, lifted the barb to his eye and baptized it in a divine tear. Then the arrow was sped and struck the sun god full in the face, and the sun was shivered into 1,000 fragments, which fell to the earth, causing a great conflagration. Then Taiwats, the hare god, fled before the destruction he had wrought. And as he fled, the burning earth consumed his feet, consumed his legs, consumed his body, consumed his hands and his arms. All were consumed but his head alone, which bowled across the valleys and over the mountains, fleeing this destruction from the burning earth, until at last, swollen with heat, the eyes of the god burst and the tears gushed forth in a flood, which spread over the earth and extinguished the fire. The sun god was now conquered, and he appeared before the council of the gods to await sentence. In that long council were established the days and the nights, the seasons and the years, and the length thereof. And the sun was condemned to travel across the firmament by the same trail day after day until the end of time. Now, you could probably spend hours going over this myth, and there are other versions of it. And all those connections, I just find it the most beautiful myth that I have come across. And I wish that sometime in the future to have somebody from the Utes Nation tell this myth. And we can see how this myth beautifully recreates order out of nature's chaos. The social problems of war and peace were mirrored. The final thing that we get out of this is a wayward sun that sets the earth aflame and a great flood that changes the world utterly. This is the western United States. The Utes were linguistically related to the Aztecs. The Utes are in this area right here. And then as you go south, you get connected to the Aztecs, and it's the Uto-Aztec language. In the Aztecs have the story of Aztlan, the white island that is destroyed in a deluge. As you go north, mythologically, the Utes are connected with the Kootenai that are right in here, and then the Okanagan. I'm going to speak about the Okanagan a little later. All along the western edge of this mountain range, this is all land that's over 1,800 meters in the western United States, are these four mountains. This is Mount Shasta, and I'll be talking about that later, and Mount Jefferson, and Mount Rainier, and Mount Baker. Each of these mountains, incidentally, have a Mount Ararat-like story. But before I get onto that, I also wanted to mention the Cherokee. And I think their myth also is just, mythology is just remarkable. They describe how the world will end. And this is a quote. "The earth is a great island floating in a sea of water and suspended at each of the four cardinal points by a cord hanging down from the sky vault, which is of solid rock. When the world grows old and worn out, the people will die and the cords will break, and let the earth sink into the ocean, and all will be water again." Again. So again, we have this falling sky thing. And for the Cherokee, they give a clue to where this Earth island is. There is another world under this, and it is like ours in every respect. Animals, plants, and people, save the seasons are different. And I believe that's a reference to the southern hemisphere. Now, What I've shown you so far is something that I put together in 1976. And it seemed to me that I could reconstruct Plato's account using North American mythology. And I thought Kirker's map was suggestive. And I thought Plato's account seemed to be an accurate depiction of the world as seen from Antarctica. So then I went into the hard sciences of geology, and I encountered this. This is the Antarctic ice cap. The darker colors here are thicker ice. And as you go to lighter colors, it's less. Now, in 1976, when I first looked at this, the encyclopedias claimed that confidently and absolutely that Antarctica had been under ice for 50 to 60 million years. Now, it seemed to me that Plato's account had been amazingly accurate when it came to space, that is, geography. So I decided to treat the question of time, the age of the Antarctic ice cap, as an open rather than as a closed question. In 1990, I was rewarded when two geologists made a discovery that completely reopened the question of the age of the Antarctic ice sheet. An important scientific question that had been dogmatically considered solved had to be completely reconsidered. Working just 250 miles from the South Pole, I think they were just in this vicinity right in here, the geologists found the frozen remains of a forest that was later dated to be 2 or 3 million years old. So it turns out that the encyclopedias of 1976 were wrong by as much as 58 million years. I want you to notice that the ice cap, and this black area here is like nearly 2.5 miles thick, lies on what is called Greater Antarctica, this side, and then on this side, Lesser Antarctica, and South America's over here. The ice sheet is fairly shallow. So I thought, well, that's a curious pattern. I wonder if that could be explained by the snowfall patterns. But here's the snowfall patterns. This is where it's snowing. In here, this is a polar desert. This polar desert has the greatest ice sheet in the world. We've got the area of greatest ice has the least amount of snowfall, while the area of least ice receives the most snowfall. So current snowfall patterns cannot produce the ice sheet that we have today. In this case, the present is not the key to the past. Now, when I looked into the scientific literature to see if I could explain this anomaly, I didn't find anything at all. There was nothing to be found. Nobody seemed to be even curious about the fact that the greatest ice sheet in the world does not have snow falling upon it. And when I looked at the northern hemisphere, I found a whole host of anomalies. Now, anyone who's ever visited a museum in North America, this is a very familiar map of the Ice Age. This is what the continent looked 12,000 years ago, time of Atlantis, I might add. We are told that the native people who first arrived in America came across a land bridge some 12,000 years ago and crossed into a largely ice-free America. So they came across here. This is ice-free. And then they come through this ice-free corridor. I just wanted you to just mention for a second here that the Queen Charlotte Islands, which I'll be discussing later, the home of the Haida, wasn't covered with ice at all at this time. Now, there's several problems with this whole view. We've discovered, now the perspective is that this all happened around 12,000 years ago. But we have sites in Chile and Brazil, Pennsylvania, and New Mexico that are much, much older than that. And it is clear that the people of America have been on this continent much longer than 10,000 BC. So clearly the traditional version of how and when people first arrived in America needs also to be reopened. Another problem is, why is this ice-free corridor existing at all? Why is there no ice through here? It's an odd place for that ice to open up. And why are the ice sheets here at all? And why aren't they up here? So I had a lot of questions, and I wasn't finding any answers in the scientific literature. They just ignored these problems. But in early of 1977, I came across the work of Charles H. Hapgood. In his maps of the ancient sea kings, I learned that Kirker's map was not alone. There were other ancient maps showing Antarctica without ice, including the famous Piri-Reis map. Hapgood showed that the 1513 Piri-Reis map contained at least 24 points that were accurate within half a degree of longitude. European explorers did not match this level of accuracy until the 1770s during Captain Cook's famous voyages. The southern portion of the map depicts the subglacial features of Antarctica. This discovery was made by Captain Arlington Mallory, but Hapgood took up the map and made many more discoveries about it. Incidentally, Hapgood believed that this map included Atlantis. Here's where he placed it. Hapgood believed that Plato's whole opposite continent was reference to America, and that this island was now beneath the Atlantic Ocean seemed to be the place that matched Plato's words. But I think Hapgood got it wrong. These rocks of St. Peter and St. Paul can in no way be compared to a landmass high above sea level and larger than Libya and Asia combined. Nevertheless, Hapgood's Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings remains the classic work on ancient cartography. The second book that I read by Hapgood was his Path of the Pole, which provided a mechanism to resolve all the questions that were haunting me. Here was a theory that could explain a temperate lesser Antarctica around Plato's time of 9,600 BC, and at the same time move me towards understanding a host of other scientific problems. With Rose's help, I wrote a paper incorporating my ideas and sent them to Charles Hapgood. Hapgood enthusiastically responded to our letter and told us that our paper was the first truly scientific exploration of his work that had ever been done. Of course, we were delighted, but I was also astonished. Why had scientists ignored Hapgood's work? After all, Albert Einstein had written a glowing foreword to the first edition of the book. And a summary of the Hapgood-Einstein correspondence is also on our website. So my amazement led me to read more about the history, sociology, and philosophy of science. And I soon discovered that what happened to Hapgood wasn't unusual at all. There was a vast difference between the sociology and logic of science. Logically, Hapgood's theory of Earth Crustal Displacement should not have been ignored. But that's not the way science works. So let's consider his idea now. Here's the inside of the Earth, the core, the mantle, and the crust. I'm going to blow up the outer edge because that's where we're interested in. Now, the yellow area is the area that we're interested in here. We call it the crust, or the scientists call it lithosphere. And notice that it includes the ocean basins and the continents. And it rests on this red area here that is called the asthenosphere, which means weak zone. And below that is the mantle. Now, an Earth crust displacement is a movement of the entire lithosphere or crust over the asthenosphere. The continents aren't moving in relationship to each other. It's the whole crust moving relative to the Earth's axis. The axis remains stable. What's the consequences of this? I'd like to read how Rose described that. The consequences of a crustal displacement are monumental. As the Earth's crust ripples over its interior, the world is shaken by incredible earthquakes and floods. The sky appears to fall as the crust shifts position. Day after day, the sun seems to rise and set over an altered horizon until finally the crust grinds to a halt. Beneath the ocean, earthquakes generate massive tidal waves that crash against the coastlines, flooding them. Some lands are shifted to warmer climates. Others, propelled into the polar zones, suffer the direst of winters. Melting ice caps released from the polar areas raise the ocean level ever higher. All living creatures must adapt, migrate, or die. To understand the climatic upheaval that was created by the Earth's shifting crust, we need to see the location of the crust relative to the Earth's axis before and after the displacement. Here we have North America relative to the polar zone. The top circle represents today's Arctic Circle. The bottom circle represents the Arctic Circle before the Earth's crust shifted. You'll notice that these two circles overlap, the gray area, on Greenland. And that explains why Greenland has the most glaciation in the northern hemisphere. And incidentally, Greenland has the same phenomena as Antarctica. The area of thickest ice has the least amount of snowfall. And the reason that Greenland has so much ice in the northern hemisphere is because it never had a chance to melt. The crust that used to be in the Arctic Circle, here in blue, includes the Great Lakes as well as Lake Winnipeg, Great Slave Lake, and hundreds of thousands of other smaller lakes. North America is a water-rich continent because it used to be trapped in the polar zone. The green area in the present Arctic Circle marks lands which were once temperate. In When the Sky Fell, we show that Arctic Norway, northern Alaska, and Siberia, these were all temperate conditions. There was animals such as hyenas, saber-toothed tigers, antelope, and a whole menagerie of species that we associate with East Africa. Now, before I take you to the other side of the world, I wanted to take you to Mars for just a minute. I'm not going to show you anything here, but I'll just tell you. In December of 1985, I read an article in Scientific American which explained a series of mysteries about the surface of Mars by assuming that the whole crust had undergone an abrupt displacement. You can imagine how excited I was, and I had only wished that Hapgood had lived to see his idea being applied to another planet. To support the idea of a crustal displacement on Mars, Dr. Peter Schultz of Brown University examined the planet's craters. Asteroids or comets that impact within the polar zones have characteristic crater signatures because they land on thick deposits of dust and ice that accumulate only at the poles. Schultz scanned the Mars in search of craters exhibiting these polar features outside the polar zone. He found 2 such areas and wrote, "These zones are antipodal. They are on the opposite faces of the Earth. The deposits show many of the processes and characteristics of today's poles, but they lie near the present-day equator." Now, if the antipodal argument is offered as evidence of crustal displacement on Mars, then we should at least consider it here on Earth. So now let's look at the former position of the Earth's crust in the southern hemisphere. Here we have the southern areas that are antipodal to the ones in the north. The blue area in the South Indian Ocean is antipodal to the lakes that occupy most of Canada. Right in this area, right about there, is this island called Heard Island. And it is still covered with snow today, a great ice sheet. And it's not snowing there a lot. And it's exactly antipodal to the province of Saskatchewan in Canada. Both areas are exhibiting unexplained polar features, ice in the case of Heard Island, or lakes in the form of in Saskatchewan. That's the criteria that they're using on Mars to determine that the crust moved on Mars. Greater Antarctica, in the gray area here, has so much, and this is where all the ice sheet was, as you recall. It has so much ice because it was in the Antarctic Circle both before and after the displacement. And Lesser Antarctica has such a small and shallow ice sheet because it was once temperate. And it is antipodal to an area of the globe that was teeming with life in Arctic Norway, Alaska, Siberia, and Beringia. I spoke a moment ago about the difference between the logic and sociology of science. And I can think of no better place to demonstrate this disparity than in Beringia. Every archaeologist is perfectly willing to accept that there was once a subcontinent which lay between Siberia and Alaska 12,000 years ago that was teeming with wildlife, which is now dead beneath the ocean. But anyone who entertains the notion that the same thing may have occurred on the exact opposite side of the Earth is breaking a taboo. To speak of a lost continent in the north, yet to deny one in the south, defies logic. And I think that point is very clear when you ask any archaeologist about Beringia. They accept it. Could the same thing happen on the other side of the Earth? Unthinkable. All these animals that died, too, need to be explained as well. And this area I call the Ring of Death is the area that shows of the globe that experienced the greatest latitude change. It also happens to be where all the animals died. So all through this area here, these areas here are experiencing massive extinctions. But over here, you're not getting extinctions. So there's a pattern there. You get, in Africa, elephants and lions survive, but in North America, the same animals, similar animals, die off. Now I'd like to return you to Ice Age America for a second. Before the displacement, the North Pole was up here. This is north, what we today call east. So for people to move from here, across Beringia, down to California, for example, they're moving from west to east. They're not doing this big north thing and then down through the ice-free corridor. America is part of Asia. It's a continuous landmass. It's as old as Asia. The people who have been in America are as old as the people who have been in Asia. It's no big deal to get to America when the pole is in a different position. And we believe that the people of the native people of America have been here for as maybe 80,000 years. Certainly, there's good evidence for 55,000 years and 40,000 and 30,000, but as long as 80,000 years ago, they may have been here. And this is absolutely a taboo to say in archaeology, where most people are still sticking to 12,000. This is Mount Shasta in California, as captured by photographer Robert Mackenzie. The Shasta believed that Mount Shasta was a refuge for their ancestors at the time of the flood. They climbed the mountain to escape the rising ocean. So this implies that they were there when the ocean level changed. And we all know when the ocean level changed, 12,000 years ago. And we have two different types of stories in America. We have the stories of people climbing mountains, Mount Shasta and Mount Jefferson. And then we have stories of people arriving in boats, having had to escape their destroyed homeland. And in the Okanagan, who I mentioned earlier, of British Columbia, tell of a time of their ancestors escaping from a sinking island in the middle of the ocean. Now, if you're in British Columbia, the middle of the ocean is not referring to the Atlantic. Okay? So it's one ocean, same ocean. There is an island in the middle of the ocean. The Haida of the Queen Charlottes tell this story, and this is a summary of their legend. Long ago, their ancestors lived in the world's largest village. Life was carefree until the chief of the heavens decided to destroy humankind by changing the sky and bringing a worldwide flood. Survivors escaped in a large canoe that took them to a new land where they landed on a mountaintop, and a new era begins. Now, we believe that the sky did appear to change dramatically before the flood, and we take perfectly seriously the Haida's notion of the existence of a formerly great city that was lost at the time of the flood. Perhaps archaeologists should listen with a little bit more respect to the so-called stories of the first people. And these stories are told all around the world. This mountain I'm using here just as symbolizing it. It could be Mount Ararat. It could be Mount Fuji. It could be Mount Baker. There's mountains all over the world that have the same story. In South America, in Asia, in North America. In Japan, in 681 AD, the Emperor Temmu ordered the Guild of Narrators to record the most ancient myths. The resulting book, the Kojiki, told of a time when the earth was very young, and the first land, called Onogoro-jima, lay near the North or South Pole. Now, I believe that Onogoro-jima and Atlantis are different names for Antarctica. Now, I realize that these are bold claims, and I think I did present some extraordinary evidence for the reality of an Earth crust displacement in my 1981 article in the Anthropological Journal of Canada. And a copy of that's in the appendix of our book. The problem of the origins of agriculture is this. For hundreds of thousands of years, people had been living by gathering and hunting. And then suddenly, around 9,600 BC, the very date that Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis, on different continents, using different crops, agriculture appears. It's just like a drop. Suddenly, we've got agricultural experiments. Now, they don't all stick with it, but the earliest experiments all date to that time. Now, I saw the Atlanteans behind this, but I couldn't use that word if I wanted to be published in the scientific literature, so I wrote up my article, and I gave an ecological argument for the origins of our agriculture. And I'd like to show you now just the highlights of that argument. What we have here is what I call the Horn of Plenty, which really is the Tropic of Cancer is the bottom part of it, and the old Tropic of Cancer is the northern part of it. In this one area, all, I emphasize, all of the old world civilizations first appeared. And virtually all the plants and animals that were domesticated in this one zone. Even though you've got places like Europe and Russia, which today produce incredible amounts of agriculture, everything is derived from this one zone. And as you go through this zone, the widest area here is right through here, China. And China has the greatest number of crops. You go on to India, they have the second highest number of crops. And then as you go down, it gets less and less crops, but more intensively used. Just to say a little bit about China, we've lost so much from China, and I'm sure that we will find in the future things from China and Japan that are much more ancient than is currently believed. But I'd like to go to India because we have a wonderful person here who began the whole stuff on precession, did a lot of work in that area. Paul Gangadhar Tilak. He was called the beloved leader of the people. Gandhi actually took up the ideas that Tilak developed. This is the first nationalist for India. He devised the idea of passive resistance. And he was imprisoned in 1897 for sedition. And he had to work all day long working with dye. And they were long hours, too, like 12 hours a day. And then they would go into their cells and there was nothing to do. Now, some scholars in England, Max Muller and a few others, heard about Tilak's condition. And Tilak had been a published scholar at this time. And they petitioned the Queen Victoria, to allow Tilak to read. So he got a light bulb. And but they wouldn't give him anything of current nature because he was a leader, and they didn't want him to know what was going on. So what he did is he got the Vedas, and he spent every night reading the Vedas for years. And then it was finally, I think it was 1903, he came out with a book. He was released. And he went up into the mountains, and he wrote down everything that he believed he'd learned about the Vedas. And he came out with a book called The Arctic Home in the Vedas. And here's a passage that he summarized from the Zend-Avesta, which is from Persia or modern-day Iran. Aurora Mazda warns Yima, the first king of men, of the approach of a dire winter, which is to destroy every living creature by covering the land with a thick sheet of ice and advises Yima to build a vara, or enclosure, to preserve the seeds of every kind of animal and plant. Yima escapes from Ariana Vejo, the island paradise now at the pole, in a ship which, like Noah's Ark, survives the flood. Now, I believe that Tillich was right about the ice-covered island at the pole, but I think it was Antarctica, not the Arctic. Getting that back to the Horn of Plenty for a moment here, at the bottom here, like I was saying, right in this area, the area that is known as the Fertile Crescent, we get wheat, barley, goats, pigs, and sheep. And in this area you have the Sumerian civilization. And they have a legend of the lost island paradise of Dilmun. And it has almost the exact same sequence as the story of the Haida. Moreover, Russian scientists have linguistically related the Haida and the ancient Sumerians. Now, it's a long way from present-day Iraq to British Columbia. But here's the same story that I told you earlier, again summarized. Long ago, when their ancestors lived on the island of Dilmun, like the great village of the Haida, this island was carefree until the sky god and the flood god decided to destroy humankind by changing the sky and bringing a worldwide flood. Survivors escaped in a large ship which took them to a new land where they landed on a mountaintop. A new era begins. Almost identical story to the Haida, and they're linguistically related. And now we come to Egypt, where the story of Atlantis originated. I remember the first telephone conversation I had with John Anthony West. John actually wrote the afterword to our book. And he asked me, where did I think the Egyptians were before the flood? And I replied that I thought that they might have been in the highlands of Ethiopia, and I'll show you why. The highlands of Ethiopia were midway between the current and former path of the equator. This tropical oasis was a place of refuge from the rising ocean, and it contained a freshwater lake, Lake Tana. Now, Graham Hancock, in his Signing the Seal, associated Lake Tana with the Ark of the Covenant, and this is entirely plausible, in my view. After the crustal displacement, survivors on Lake Tana could follow the Blue Nile downstream to an area near present-day Sudan. Here, the Blue and White Nile tributaries merged to form the Nile River. And here, near present-day Khartoum, there emerged a culture known as Nubia, where agriculture began around 10,000 BC, the very date that Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis. Now, there's some other highland tropical oases. Draw your attention to the one on the bottom, which is Spirit Cave. Spirit Cave is an archaeological site that dates quite close to 9,600 BC, and it has the earliest experiments with rice. And I believe in this area we're ultimately going to find more archaeological discoveries that haven't yet been made. And on the exact opposite side of the Earth, you go exactly on the opposite side of the Earth, you've got Lake Titicaca. And it, too, is a highland between the two equators, midway between the two equators. So what happens there is that, at Lake Titicaca, you were 1,000 miles away from the equator, both before and after the displacement. So the ecology was stable. And anybody who was a survivor of the destruction that occurred, who ended up there, whether by choice or by chance, would have found a place where they could survive. Elsewhere, animals were dying, plants were dying, the ecology was in just total uproar. These are the only areas where agriculture begins. This is Lake Titicaca, as photographed by Frederick Learman. And on the lake we have the massive remains of Tiahuanaco. And it was here that Arthur Panansky did his work. And he associated these buildings with the Atzland, the white island that was a former homeland of the Aztecs. Lake Titicaca is the cousin, if you like, of Lake Tana. So I was always interested in this area, and one day, let me just show you, the people who live here are the Amera. And in 1984, when Rose and I were in England, we used to spend the Sunday mornings reading the papers. One of the great pleasures of living in England is having great newspapers. And every Sunday morning we would go out and get the papers and read them from cover to cover and listen to the radio. And one day, it was in November, I think, in 1984, I came across this article in the London Times about the Amera language. And let me just quote from you from the London Times about this language. Amera is rigorous and simple, which means that its syntactic rules always apply and can be written out concisely in the sort of algebraic shorthand that computers understand. Indeed, such is its purity that some historians think that it did not just evolve like other languages, but was actually constructed from scratch. An artificial language. It would be hard to imagine how and why the Amera would find time to invent a language. Such a development was much more likely the product of an advanced civilization like that of Atlantis. I am convinced that the Amera language is another holographic fragment from a lost world. This artificial language, which doesn't evolve and remains pure, may just be a key to both our past and our future. I mentioned here that they're using trivalent logic rather than binary logic. And I believe that that's the next generation of computers will go that way. But we'll see. If they do, it would be very useful to have young people who are interested in computers learning Amera, because they might very well be able to make some scientific breakthroughs in computer science. Now, our belief in progress locks us into a linear notion of time. We see ourselves progressing towards the future, leaving the past behind. But this is only a modern fixation, a deep assumption of how to view time. The Amera people of Lake Titicaca look at time another way. They treat the future as behind them. They consider the future a hidden place that they can't see, a place that they will inevitably arrive at, but need not focus on. Psychologically, the Amera face the past. And like them, we can learn from the past. Now, Plato gave us clues not only to the location of the continent, but also to the city of Atlantis. Because Atlantis is like New York. It's like New York, New York. We've got Atlantis, Atlantis. Okay? And the city of Atlantis is gigantic. It's the size of modern-day London. Okay? And he gives us the clues. Where on Antarctica, or where on Atlantis, is this city? First clue. Midway on the seaward side toward the islands. We have a continent that has islands off the midway point. Completely surrounded by mountains. Now, if you're on the coast, to be completely surrounded by mountains, the islands must be mountainous. That is the case in Antarctica. This is the area in red here that we believe is the site of a city. Now, this is only the size of Pennsylvania now. So we've moved from looking for the city of Atlantis from a size of North America to the size of Pennsylvania. And we're looking for a city the size of Greater London. Not Inner London, but Greater London. And what Rose and I have been doing for these past 20 years can be encapsulated in just one photograph by an artist, Tom Miller, and some of you may have seen this on the cover of Atlantis Rising. That is, excavating the remains of a long-lost yet advanced civilization. Who knows what we will find in their libraries? Who knows what we'll think of their art and their sciences, their religion? Is there wisdom there? I am convinced no matter what we do, we find there, it will completely revolutionize our concept of time. The present need not be the only key to understanding time. It is not too late for us to listen to the wisdom of the ancients. The past can enrich and even guide our future. It is a key to our present and the future. And that's it. Thank you. Now, questions?